something happening here. But what it is ain't exactly clear. There's a man with a gun over there, telling me I got to beware. I think it's time we stop, children. What's that sound? Everybody look what's going down.
Salutations, good morning, and welcome. This is your host for the Readman Truth to Power Hour on 103.5 WNHH, New Haven, Connecticut, where we rock the state of Connecticut, we rock the nation, and we have a very, very special guest with us today. If we look back from the early 2000s to 2025 now, I think my guest would agree that we have had 25, 30 years of education reform failure that has spent $2 trillion. And what do we have lately this week? It comes down to, we talk about school attendance and our children, anywhere from 25 to 30% in urban settings and poor rural settings, absenteeism. And I always like to say, well, why don't you give them something to come to school for? Why don't you give them something to read worthwhile? But anyway, I'm sorry. I'm taking this off the agenda. I want you to meet the oracle of high stakes testing damage, Angela Engel. Angela, could you introduce yourself and just tell us a little bit about your passions, and then we'll get started.
Yeah. Well, I'm Angela Engel, and I started out in education. I actually started my first nonprofit when I was 19 years old, working with at-risk kids. My heart is with the at-risk student population. And I started a nonprofit to train mentors and tutors, trained 100 volunteers, and was headed for law school and decided I just couldn't do it. So I ended up becoming a teacher. And it was at a time when standards was just happening. And I thought, wow, I'm really part of this new revolutionary thing that's going to transform education and make it spectacular. And I was completely on board, and I was a fourth grade teacher. And so when high stakes testing came to Colorado, it was 1998. It was before No Child Left Behind. And I was the first cohort of teachers to pilot the first state standardized test. And quite honestly, I thought it was going to be great. I was excited. I wanted a way for educators to prove what the good work that we were doing in the classroom. And I saw that test and my stomach just absolutely flipped, because it was the worst assessment I had ever been forced to give my students. It was horribly written. Obviously, it's multiple choice, so you're getting the lowest levels of learning. And the prompts were just ridiculous. They weren't meaningful. That wasn't good literature that the kids were being asked to read. And so I started digging. And when I started digging, I started realizing that we have a big problem, because these tests are racially biased. They're not validated for accuracy or validity. And so when you have a bad measurement tool, everything that comes from that is bad policy. You're like using a failed measurement tool to make policy, and what you get is a big mess. And it just was an era where accountability, test-based accountability, was the rally call. And so I was up against, kind of a brick wall. And the biggest thing that I learned is that the number one correlating factor to test scores is socioeconomic status. So essentially, by adopting a high stakes test-based accountability system, what we were doing was rewarding wealthy kids in wealthy districts with lots of resources, and punishing the low-income students that didn't have resources and didn't have opportunities. And over the last 23 years since No Child Left Behind passed, we've seen schools close, we've seen student engagement fall off, teacher retention. Half of the teachers that go into the teacher profession leave within the first 5 years. High stakes testing has destroyed public education.
I pretty much says it all, and it's a very expensive entity. So when we look at it, it's nearly $2 billion a year, and it's actually more because when you and I started, and I too have been engaged in fighting this battle for a long, long time, my whole career. But when we look at the time, so when you said 1998, we had high stakes testing was coming to Colorado. Yes, the test was bad, but the way the test was working pre No Child Left Behind was that we did a sampling across the nation,
Yeah,
and we didn't make every child take the test.
right.
Most children never even only saw a piece of the test, if they saw any. And that sampling is really, it's considered the gold Cadillac internationally. Nobody tests everybody in PISA. They take a sampling over there. And so what it meant was, and in terms of disruption to the school, the children that were not taking, who were not taking a piece of that test, were learning that day. I always tell people when you're testing, you're not learning. So there's a piece to that, a small sampling piece. It did, and yes, it was. I looked at the assessments too. Standards did not improve education. It seemed to, rather than create a standard of humanity and care and concern to create good citizens, we created something that could give us numerical data points that really are meaningless. But anyway, we've got lots of agreement. But let's
Yeah,
tell me
it's
about how you started this. How did you become because you just weren't a teacher anymore. You became an activist. Your advocacy is gone on decades. So tell
yeah.
us about that because I don't know how that begins.
Well, once I learned about the test, who was grading it, you know, it's painful to be a visionary, but I'm not the only one. And there were a lot of people in education that were saying this is a horrible idea. Marie Wersing was a professor when I was getting my master's degree in curriculum and instruction, and she really opened my eyes. And I loved it because she had this question on the board. And when we walked in the room, the question was, what were the conditions that gave rise to Hitler's Nazi Germany? And so that I just, when I look back, here's the book, the Nazi Germany source book.
Okay.
And it talks about how, Hitler started with education and he got control over the curriculum and kicked out, anyone who was different and not going to teach that curriculum in their schools. That's how you brainwash an entire country into being willing to sacrifice the humanity of 10 million other people. So that Marie Wersing was and my master's degree, and also the culmination of all of this happening at the same time. It wasn't like I needed someone to convince me because I was in the classroom teaching standards, administering the test, and I was seeing the life and the vitality drain out of my classroom. And it's really important that people understand why, because before in public education, the purpose was to educate the child so that we could sustain democracy. It was like our job was to create an educated and empowered citizenry, not workforce, but citizenry, who then held our local elected government accountable. And when test-based accountability came into play, it flipped that model on its head. And so no longer were we, the educators, the safeguards of democracy, ensuring that we would sustain a republic that had educated and informed citizens who were paying attention, who knew how to, spot corruption and lies and deceit, and when we were going to have to forfeit our rights. And so now, instead of an educated citizenry, now what we have are the students that are holding teachers accountable. It's like, the right said, let's hold the teachers accountable for all of society's ills. And if we can do away with public education, then we can accomplish what Hitler accomplished, which was make them believe what we want them to believe. And if you think about what happened in 2002 with No Child Left Behind and where we are today with voter apathy and a distrust in government, those two things are correlated. So really seeing what was being laid out for the future of this country, public education is a pillar of our democracy, and so is a free press. And those two things, if you're going to die on a hill, then those two things, public education and a free press, are the hill you die on for democracy. And Jesse, I just want to say two things because I think you've been teaching for a long time and I've been teaching for a long time. And there's this myth that all of corporate education reform was built on. And the myth was that we didn't have a curriculum. And right here I have this Alabama, of all states, the Alabama curriculum from 1964. And so we had curriculum, we had essentially what was standards. The difference is this was written by educators in the state of where those kids were being educated. And what we saw with Common Core was a bunch of corporate interests writing a curriculum so that they could then have the monopoly. You're right. We've had NAEP, the National Assessment of Educational Progress, since the 1960s. It is it's the most accurate assessment that exists. It's nonprofit and it evaluates a sampling of students. And what we've learned from the NAEP is that since we've adopted high stakes testing accountability, our students are performing worse than they were before.
That's in my last show we had mentioned that our high school students scored higher in 2002 than they have all of this stuff in there. But when and I want to bring us back to we had curriculum. So my viewers from New Haven in Connecticut, if they're my age and they had children growing up in our public schools, they might remember that across socioeconomic status, we had a social studies curriculum that began in the third grade. We had what we called study the states. We had 50 states. So every third grader had to pick a state. They could pick any. They might pick Colorado. And they would do a sort of little report about Colorado and learn all about Colorado. Mm-hmm. And in the third grade, they were introduced to the states. And then in the fourth grade, they were asked to study Connecticut. And so because we were from Connecticut, their kids studied Connecticut all year long in their social studies class, learning all about Connecticut, all about our role in this great democratic nation. And then in the fifth grade, it came to U.S. history, the first introduction to history across the nation. And then in the eighth grade, they did U.S. history again. Then in the 10th grade, they did U.S. history again. In the ninth grade, they did world history. 10th grade. So we see this curriculum that you're talking about, meaningful, powerful curriculum, teaching children about citizenship, about freedom, about democracy. That's all gone now. Mm-hmm. That's all gone. To standards and testing that I think I mentioned at the beginning, our attendance rate in communities of color, poor, urban and rural school districts is between 25% and 30% absenteeism. So any of your measures can't make any sense because if your students are out a third of the year, it makes no sense at all over there. But what have we lost? And so I want to think about that piece. What have we lost? Because when you in your book, Seeds of Tomorrow, Solutions for Parent Children's Education, it was a phenomenal book. Came out in 2009. It packed everything we needed into a literature review for 1,000 dissertations into about, I don't think it was 200 pages, but it was well written, you touched upon the eugenics, you touched upon the STEM, but in there you also, because you mentioned you were a teacher, just like me, and you talked about students responding to meaningless prompts. I mentioned this kid, Jeffrey. You don't have to remember, that book was written a long time ago, but you could give us a generic, what were your students, how were they responding to these prompts? I think in your thing you said some kid came up to you and said, they want me to write a story, and it's really stupid.
Yeah. Yeah, so it was Jeffrey, and he was a brilliant writer, very creative, and we've seen this happen all across the country. We've seen this happen. But basically, he came up and said, Mrs. Engel, they want me to write about an alien on a hill, and
Oh,
I
wait,
don't want
what
to write
grade was
about
that? What grade was that?
fourth
Just
grade. Fourth
fourth
grade.
grade. Yeah.
Yeah, and
Okay.
he's like, I don't want to write about an alien on a hill. And I was like, and that's the problem is that, standardized tests teach conformity and compliance. That's all they're teaching. And so, he wasn't engaged. He wasn't, there wasn't any buy-in. And we've seen really wonderful students who are writing and they have a teacher that's trying to get the best score on the tests. And so she teaches them the formula of how those essays are graded. And so you have to say a certain word 6 times. So the kids, like, instead of being imaginative, using lots of literary, terms and being creative, instead you get this like formulaic writing that meets the standards because the graders only get like 6 seconds or 16 seconds to grade that essay, and they're just looking spot checking for certain words. And so teachers who teach to the test end up with the least creative writers, and it's an injustice that we have families that are choosing their schools based on test scores. Because instead of getting these vibrant neighborhood schools that, have a broad curriculum and lots of engagement, family engagement, and lots of enrichment programs for students, instead they're picking the schools that are most aligned with a single test that when their child graduates from school, they're never going to see again. So essentially, all of that time and test preparation was wasted. And so you asked the question, what have we lost in test-based accountability? We have lost the purpose of public education, number one. And it's like the soul of education has been compromised because it's been exploited. And we've seen this happen in the healthcare industry too. Instead of trusting the professionals, which are the nurses and the doctors, now we have insurance companies that are just getting fat and rich and patients that can't get medical care. And it's the same thing that's happened in education. Our kids aren't getting an education. Our teachers don't have the autonomy to meet the needs of their students. They aren't given the authority and the respect. They're only given the responsibility to do well on these tests. And that is something that's completely beyond their control because socioeconomic status, as I said before, is the number one correlating factor to test scores. So, of course, teachers that have students that have had preschool, lots of opportunity, enrichment, tutors, after, athletics, music, all of that, those students have had more exposure to the kind of content that they see in those tests, and they do better. But to then punish teachers and to punish students based on those test scores is literally a return to segregation and the Jim Crow effect of, separating out. And it's intended. It's by nature. I sat down with a gentleman who had run the voucher bill in Colorado. And I said, man, you guys have really destroyed public education. And he goes, well, the thing is, before we knew that public education was failing, we just needed a measurement tool to prove it. And they picked a measurement tool that was, it was rigged. It was rigged. You said it. It's like it was fixed. You knew the room was fixed before you ever started. Standardized testing is a fix on public education, and it's designed to make way for vouchers, and that's exactly what it's done.
And when we look at this, psychometrics is the science of creating these assessments. And you can't standardize the assessment if you do not have massive failure. So I always tell people it's Groundhog Day, because it's either a norm reference standardized assessment that says half have to fall below, or it's a criteria reference which says only 35% of them can succeed. So if we look at this piece, we should know that regardless of the standards, regardless of the curriculum, regardless of what we're doing. What we have is time and time again, we will give your friend in Colorado reasons to close our schools. And someone at the beginning of the chat box, I put down, since these reforms, no Child Left Behind. Oh, we can even go back to Goals 2000 with Bill Clinton. No Child Left Behind, Bush. A Race to the Top, Obama. I mean, Every Student Succeeds Act.
Yeah.
Biden and Trump. We have this piece over here. If we look at them, 25,000 community schools have been closed because of
Yeah.
their test scores. And where they have closed have been in black and brown, poor communities. That's why you mentioned the Jim Crow. That's why we talk about the school to prison pipeline. That's why we have people like David Berliner, who just recently passed, talked about collateral damage. We have all of this concept. So when I'm thinking about it, you and I have had a similar awakening. I think you wrote your book. You thought the world would change.
Hmm.
I made presentations at the National Council of Teachers of English for years talking about resistance theories, teachers taking control of their curriculum and showing that the students were engaged and motivating and doing better when they did that. And I presented these, and I would go to our State Department of Education, testify, tell them, you're going in the wrong direction. And no one listened. But then it came to, and somewhere along the way, you began to do Uniting for Kids, and I began to walk into DC. Could you tell us about Uniting for Kids? Because it no longer was waiting for the experts. It became that activism and advocacy, and that's what we share. But yours began with Uniting for Kids, and if I'm right, I think you were telling parents, don't take the test, don't take
Yeah.
the test, opt out.
Well, we tried to get the policy leaders, the decision makers, to pay attention, to understand, and they weren't paying attention. In fact, here in Colorado, they just passed a new dashboard. So they're gonna, the stupid dashboard that collects the data and presents the data, it's like $6 million. We're one of the lowest funded per income, states, and they're buying dashboards while our kids can't get resources that they need. So it's been an uphill battle, and I started Uniting for Kids with Anthony Dahlman Jones, who's was part of the National At-Risk Network, and we thought, let's educate parents, teachers, and students so that they can push back on this. You need the will of the people. You need the collective to push back. And so it was like, if they're not informed, educate them. And so we've been doing that, and I've been doing that, and all the work I do is pro bono. I've been doing this for 23 years now. And it's really been an uphill battle, and I don't have a lot of friends because, this education reform, although it's not working, is making a lot of money. Here in Colorado, we spend $100 million on testing. And so I've done our best. I see states pushing back now. They're like, this hasn't worked. We're not going to spend any more money on it. We have, we're seeing that the little amount that the federal government gives to the states in terms of public education, their demands, their mandates cost more than what they deliver. And so right now has been an awakening. I think it's kind of a new day and a new opportunity. But we figured out early on, you know what? We don't need permission. We don't need new policy. We're still living in a free country, and all we have to do is say no. Our kids aren't going to take the test. You do whatever you're going to do, but our kids are not going to take the test. And so Don Pearl, he really led the charge from out of Greeley, Colorado. He had a large migrant population of students. He knew that they were going to be condemned from the beginning. He spoke out, and he carried an initiative to end high stakes testing here in Colorado. That didn't get passed. There's a real likelihood that we might be bringing that back again, because now we have 2 decades that say all the promises that you made failed. You said you were going to close the achievement gap. It's wider. It's even wider than it was before. You never addressed poverty. There was no such thing as an achievement gap. It was a poverty gap. And you never directed the resources towards real solutions. You misidentified the problem. And so for the last 23 years, we've been solving the wrong damn problem. And we just said, hey, let's educate parents that they can simply say no to the test. And in Colorado, it's been very successful all around the country. It became a national movement. There were other parts of the country that entire schools were saying, no, we're not going to take this test. So there were a lot of people who came to that realization at the same time, but we're really quite powerful. And the whole country could collapse high stakes testing overnight. All we have to do is keep our kids home on the days of testing. That's all we have to do. Write a note and say, my kid's not going to take that test and we're not coming to school. So the whole system collapsed. And that's the beauty of it. That's the kind of hope that I hold out for, that I continue to move forward. And I have a short story. Do I have time for a short story?
You have time. You have time.
Okay.
We have another 30 minutes.
Okay, so I've got two daughters, and we're in a pretty high income area as far as schools go. So I wrote the letter. Our kids are not going to be taking the state standardized test. And she sends me an email, and she's like, listen, we really need your test scores, Angela, because your kids are the kids that really show how well our teachers are doing. And I wrote her back and I said, you know what? My kids aren't there to make you look good. My kids don't go to school so that you can get a bonus at the end of the year because you had high test scores, or that it makes you have the highest rating and you get the blue ribbon wrapped around your school. And my kids certainly aren't going to participate in a system that makes you look good and then makes another school, on the other side of the tracks, using that metaphor, but to make other kids look bad, because that's not the purpose of education. The purpose of education is to do the most amount of good for the most amount of children. And ethically, none of us should be participating in this kind of system that sets kids up to fail. Standardization is bull crap, excuse my French, but round up any 35-year-olds and ask them if they're going to have equal reading levels and the exact same math skills. And they won't. Human beings are inherently different. We learn, we develop differently, we have different interests and different talents. And rather than catering to those strengths of our children, instead what we've adopted is the lowest common denominator. And it's watering down public education, and it's quite frankly making people stupid.
Making us stupid. So we're going to move on. But before we go on, let me help my audience understand something I say every time. $23 billion spent on predominantly wealthy white schools over poor schools of color. Every single year we've been doing that. Over there, $2 billion for standardized assessments. You mentioned the people got bonuses, so we can just look in Connecticut. Botanzas Elementary School in Hartford, Connecticut, got bonuses for Fall Stater. That the reading consultant and the principal of the school, they finagled the data and said their kids had done brilliant and they were the best school for literacy in the city of Hartford, and they lied. And we got a whole history of administrators who have been charged, fired, gone to jail, and that stuff. So we've got that piece. Another thing I want our audience to understand, Angela, when we began this in 2005, we were talking about a state standardized assessments that came around every spring, maybe. And I walked to DC because I looked at how much time it took to give these assessments, especially in poor schools. It took 4 to 6 to 8 weeks to give the assessment. Everything was test preparation. The curriculum began to just seem like it was the test in them. And what did I see? I mentioned the absentee rate. Well, if we look at the absentee rate from before COVID. I mean, they like to say, we're higher than COVID, but we're also higher than we were in 2008. All this assessment, this time away from learning, has made it easy for kids to somehow miss school, and they're missing school 25 to 30% of the time. So that's one. That data I want my parents to know. Also to know that if you're my age, we took standardized tests. That used to be, I'm sure you heard that in Colorado. We took those tests. Yeah, why can't they take those? Well, when I took the tests, we did it once in the third grade, the sixth grade, and the ninth grade, and the tests never lasted more than 2 days. And so we did the test, and so that meant over 13 years of education, I lost 6 days of learning. Today, and now it's even more. I thought when I measured in 2010 when I did my walk, it was 4 to 8 weeks, depending on your school, lost learning. Well, now because everything is embedded in the literacy curriculums, in the math curriculums, online assessments, the kids are constantly, I would say, they are taking some kind of assessment every other day in their schooling. So it's not losing 2 months, it's losing 5 months. So that component. But now we've talked a lot of the negative stuff. Now I want to talk, how should we educate? What should we do with our public schools? Because you also write about that. You also advocate for that. You're not only a naysayer, the oracle that says, oh my God, the house is fallen. You're also the oracle that says, we can change this. We can lift this. So can you tell us, how should we evaluate schools? Let's start there.
How should we evaluate schools?
Yeah.
Well, you
And
know,
then we'll
there's
do teachers and kids.
yeah.
You could take all three of them.
Yeah, there's this misconception that somehow we didn't have a measure of holding schools accountable, and we always have. In fact, I would argue that we have the best means to hold teachers accountable. First they have 35 kids in their classrooms, and those kids are talking about what's going on in that classroom all day long. If a teacher makes a misstep, it's going to be talked about. There's 70 parents, and then you have school principals, you have a school superintendent, and then you have a community elected school board. So quite honestly, education has more accountability than any system in our government. I mean, we are most closely watched, most held accountable. So we don't need more outside evaluations. And you talked about the loss of time. I know schools that their entire curriculum is preparing those kids for the test. That's all year long. That's what they do all year long. So because it's like more exposure, more familiarity to that kind of line of questioning, then the better that they do on those tests. It's horrible. What have we given? What have we delivered? It's really hard. I'm such a proponent of public education, but it's hard to defend this current version of public education. So you asked the question about how do we measure schools? Measure communities. How many libraries do they have? How many places for children to play do they have? What is being done to make sure that there's enrichment programs and after school programs, that children are safe, that children have books and meals and access to technology? Like, those are the things that we should be measuring. If you want to know what it makes a good school, ask the question about the retention of teachers. Because if teachers aren't staying in the school, that's your first indication that it is not a culture that values and trusts educators. And without that, you don't get good education.
And this is another thing. I've been working hard. I retired last year so I can work on helping to explain this to John Q, the public, the parent. And when I look at the data, I don't look at the test scores. I go back to 2000 and I see that every elementary school in the nation had a literacy specialist, had a math specialist, had a librarian, had a library,
Yeah.
had an art teacher, had a music teacher, had a home ec teacher, had teachers that taught wood shop, metal shop. They had choruses. They had a little band. Every school in the nation had these things, whether you were wealthy or you were the poorest school. And of course, it's not even just because you have them, but still you had these things. Well, now I've been looking at the data since 2000 in urban schools in Connecticut. We lost half the librarians. We lost half the music teachers, half the art teachers, half the counselors, half the social workers. We've lost that support staff. So when I look at that, that's the data. So when you say we evaluate schools, just what you're saying, we can evaluate those things. Forget about the test scores. If I want to see if an urban school, a poor school is doing well, tell me, do you have an art teacher? Do you have a library? Do you have a music teacher? Do your students get access to specialized staff? If they have IEPs, do they get this? So the public is not aware because we focus on these test scores. And I like to tell people, just my old Muhammad Ali thing. Ali used to go like this and say, "What's that? What's that? What's that one? I'm going to hit you with that big George Foreman." And then bam. And that's what they do to us. They say,
Yeah.
look at the test scores, look at the test scores. But in reality, what's happening is we're paying for this curriculum that demoralizes, disengages, causes collateral damage to our children. We're doing this in real time, and it's damage, and we know the real data that could help us. So it's equity. It's the school. What nation do researchers refer to their public schools as the school to prison pipeline? But sorry, let's get back to those ways about, now we know about schools. What about teachers? What can we do for teachers to help them in schools?
Well, gosh, pay them a living wage. Seriously, like pay them a living wage. I know this is across the country, but teachers have not even gotten inflationary increases. They're having to pay for their own, pencils and paper. And I mean, what we have done to educators in the United States is deplorable. It is inexcusable. I mean, nobody goes into education for the money, and then to scapegoat them as the problem and to continue their benefits, the cost of their benefits are going up, their salaries are going down. It's just absolutely inexcusable. And I don't know, we have this, it's not a teacher shortage. We've created a toxic culture. And where do you think your kids are going to go? Like, who's going to educate your kids if you want to continue to treat teachers like they're, the poison in the system? They're not. So, where do we go from here? The first thing that we need to understand is how children learn. And what neuroscience will tell you is that they need rich experiences. And yet we've taken away field trips. We've taken away recess and play and the things that you talked about, music and PE. Like, let's remember that these are children again, and children learn from experience. And so they need lots of rich experiences, lots of exposure to new and different things. Let's bring back field trips. Let's empower the educators to drive the decision making, not policy makers, certainly not these corporate interests that are trying to exploit our children and benefit from our public tax dollars. Really, if we have to choose where our children are the safest and our tax dollars are the safest, it's in our neighborhood schools. There isn't any better, safeguard for those monies and those interests and our sacred children, our children to be, than in the arms of our teachers. So we've got to restore trust in educators again, and make classrooms safe, and make sure that they respect child development, and understand that we're not trying to educate every child for the exact same skills. But what we're trying to do is the most good for the most amount of students. And we've got like a high school here in Colorado. They have 64 different spoken languages. So our kids, our teachers and our kids don't need higher stakes and more punishments. They need support. They need resources. It's real simple.
Real simple. They need resources. So now we've got this because the public has to be listening and saying, well, why isn't anybody listening? Why aren't our policymakers? Why aren't our legislators listening? So I want to come to something the public may not understand. The connection to CEOs and corporations and charter schools. This is a massive money making thing when 53 million children need pencils and papers and Chromebooks. We are talking about one of the most massive potentials for profit. So, is there a connection to these failed reforms and charter schools and CEOs and corporate America?
Yeah, well, you said it. It's a moneymaker. It's a moneymaker. And in the United States right now, we are up against, that's what we're up against, is who is it making money for and who is paying the bill? And so our kids are paying the price for these record profits in these education management organizations, for these test publishers. It's making them a lot of money. And we don't have enough teachers and students that are going into these committee hearings when legislators are making the decisions and saying, stop serving the corporate interests and start serving the public interests. And the public interests mean smaller class sizes, paying teachers better salaries. You know, the reason that they don't do it, we know what needs to be done. The reason that they don't do it, and this is where the system is again rigged, is that money buys elections, money buys candidates. And so they go to the money. They don't go to what is in the best interest of public. And until we figure out a way to do campaign finance reform, we're going to continue to pay more into an education with system with fewer returns. We're going to continue to pay more in a healthcare system with fewer returns to us until we get that corporate reform or campaign finance reform figured out. It's all connected. It's all connected. It's like rig the elections, you know, and then you rig the policies, and then all the money goes into the people that are buying the elections. It's the makings of fascism.
Yeah, it sounds insane.
It is insane.
Yes, it
It's
is insane.
insane.
And
It's
it's connected. And when we think about assessment, my major complaint with all assessment, all standardized assessment, is that if I had a medicine and I was going to improve a medicine, had to be tested, I need to talk to the patient. How's it make you feel? Does it make you dizzy? Does it make you nauseous? Are you feeling a little shaky? You can't measure those things with a blood test. You have to ask the person. So so in medicine, I need to ask them. I need to ask the caregivers. In education, that would be the teachers and the family members. We talk to the people we are treating. And so we don't do that in education. No one's talking to the kids. Wouldn't they tell us right now?
teachers are. Teachers
Yeah,
are talking to the
teachers
kids.
are. But
Teachers are
teachers
talking to
are.
the kids and they know. And that's why we are not able to stay in the profession because it has been corrupted.
So we need to uncorrupt it. So I want to go back then, and this is where I think Uniting for Kids, when I did my first walk to DC and we created Save Our Schools, and we rallied in DC with about 12,000 people, with every major education theorist I could think of at that time. And we did that. So I want to bring us to something that this is not hopeless, because what's today? Friday. So Thursday during the day, 30,000 students in Charlotte left their schools and protested ICE. By the end of the day, ICE, I'm sure they never noticed, but ICE all of a sudden said, we will be leaving Charlotte and we are going to New Orleans. So what I want us to do is get for that basic advocacy. Let's talk about that advocacy, because you said it, if we all did, if we stopped taking the test, We'd crush them over day. If we walked out of the schools, if every teacher walked out of the schools would collapse, and not the schools. Our legislators would collapse because their phones would go, hey, my kid's not in school today. I can't go to work. It would be massive. But we have this power. And I want to, and I know that this is true for you and it's true for me. While we may not have changed the world, it's been enough to keep the spark alive
Yeah.
because we speak up, we talk up. So talk to us about advocacy for changing our public schools. And, that's the future. How
Yeah.
do we do that, or where can we begin? No simple answer, but tell us about your thoughts on the hope of advocacy and activism in education.
Yeah. Well, and Jesse, I so respect all of the work that you did to raise awareness. And I remember tracking you, on your march. And I think that the most important thing we can do is continue to be living examples of empowered citizens that adhere to the truth. I I have this my own little kind of mantra that's like, I'm going to outlive you. you know, Eventually I will outlive all of those greedy, you know, interests that didn't have our children's interests at heart. And I'm going to keep talking about this, and I'm not going away, and I'm not going to lose heart, even though it's continued to decline and go in a direction that is negative, and against all we know about research and how children learn. And, it's like they are like, the data matters, the data matters. And then I'm like, well, look at the data. Because the data will show you that your policies have failed. And we've got Margaret Spellings, like calling for a doubling down on high stakes testing. That's literally like learning that cigarettes cause cancer, and then the Surgeon General saying, we want you to smoke more. Like that, it's literally the same thing. So I think this is what I want to say. I really believe in people, and that's a hard thing to do, given the current state of things. We have, the number of people that aren't voting in our elections. That's what feels soul crushing for me, is like you can't even vote. You're walking to Washington, and I'm dedicating a whole lifetime to this, and you can't even circle in the ballots. Like what is your problem? It's very frustrating for me. But I think they feel like the system is rigged too, and they don't have a voice in it. And so what we need to do is just continue to elevate those people that do have power and do exercise and leverage power. And I think our kids are going to do great things. They're resilient, and they're really good at spotting the bull crap. They're really good at seeing right through it. So when we have kids that are saying, we're not playing along, we're not going to engage in this, we're not going to conform, and we're not going to comply, they are exercising the whole intent of public education, which is get the information, get the facts, and then act according to your conscience. And so they might be teaching, my generation had it easy. And they didn't have the Vietnam War. There wasn't a need to rise up collectively because we've been comfortably comfortably lulled into submission and compliancy and complacency. But I think this younger generation is able to look ahead and see the lack of opportunity and where the dollars are going, and how they're paying into a system that then is, building bigger ballrooms, for crying out loud. We have an industrial war complex. How many times do you need to blow the world up? Like, how much money are we going to continue to invest in an industrial war complex who has more fraud, waste, and abuse? And the difference that they're not calling for accountability in the Pentagon is because it's male dominated. And in education, it's a female dominated profession where they're like, let's hold their feet to the fire, let's crucify them again. And yet we as taxpayers continue to direct our dollars to this industrial war complex, while our kids can't get a free lunch, while why they can't get computers, and they are dealing with classrooms that are so overcrowded they don't have enough desks. Like at some point it breaks. At some point you've oppressed it to the level that it just collapses. And that's where the opportunity lies. The opportunity lies after the collapse in saying, now, wait a minute, let's look at what hasn't worked. High stakes testing hasn't worked. Standardization hasn't worked. Let's look at what has worked. And what has worked are rich, expanded curriculums, things like music and PE, things like vocational education, multiple avenues, not just a one size fits all education where everybody has to go to college. Let's create multiple pathways. I love the magnet school model. I think the magnet school model was brilliant, and I think we need more choice in education. And the dichotomy that I've had to contend with is that I'm demanding more choice, more curriculum choices, more course choices, more kind of school style choices, more kind of different philosophies of learning for parents and teachers, and students to be able to choose from at a time where the accountability is a one size fits all kind of accountability. It's counter to choice. And then what we have is a movement from the far right that says our schools are failing and we want vouchers and we want charter schools so that we can send the kids to the schools of our choice. Well, guess what? I'd like somebody else to pay for a Mercedes Benz for me, but that's not how it works. Mm-hmm. Instead, what we all get are roads, pretty good roads. They're not perfect roads, but pretty good roads for us to get our produce and our, packages delivered and our mail delivered, and be able to go to work every day. But the idea that then we're going to pay for somebody else to have an elite education at the expense of taxpayers, is hogwash. But that's the intended design. Just collapse public education. And you're going to see from the federal government and the Trump administration voucher policy initiatives to privatize all of public education throughout the country. Mm-hmm. And democracy is done for at that point. So it's a coordinated agenda.
Yeah. And to think, when we look at charters, there's never been a more massive corrupt movement in public education. More than half of them are gone before their first year are out. We can't even, nobody can chase down the countless hundreds of billions of dollars that has literally just been stolen and taken. Yeah. It seems to be there's no accountability for those. And with magnet schools, I too do like magnet schools, but I remind people what the purpose of magnets are. We have a wonderful new magnet school in Connecticut, the Anna Grace Academy. It's a wonderful school. It's named after Anna Grace, who's one of the 6-year-olds who was murdered at Newtown. It has so much art, so much music, everything you could think of, every bell and whistle. Every kid's just run into the school and want to be there. And you see, and that's a good thing. But if you're a magnet, the purpose of magnets were to take what works in a magnet school and to do it, replicate it in all of your schools. And that's the what I haven't seen in magnets. I have seen we all love to lift and raise some schools, and no school is more. I have my purple tie on because of Anna Grace. She loved purple. That school is a beautiful, well-deserving school. But the purpose of that school is to change all schools. Anna Grace would not say just some kids. She would say, do this for all the kids. So we've done all that kind of stuff over there, and we're getting down to our last few minutes. And I know the politics. I know the advocacy. Tell us a little bit, because this advocacy takes its toll on us. Oh, we're getting ready. Okay. Thank you. What a wonderful guest. Salutations, people. love, peace, read, listen, and speak truth.
Something happened.
Thank you,
103
Jesse.
FM.
I
New
so
Haven,
appreciate
the
you having
best.
us on, having me on.
Exactly
You're welcome.
clear. There's a man with a gun over there, telling me I got to beware. I think it's time we stop, children. What's that sound? Everybody look what's going down.
Thank you, Harry.